At 11:47 this morning, the United States Supreme Court released a 6-3 decision in Learning Resources Inc. versus Trump that obliterated the legal foundation of President Trump's entire tariff empire. The court ruled that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize the president to impose tariffs during declared national emergencies. $170 billion in tariffs across every major trading partner were invalidated in a single ruling. Trump's own appointees, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, sided with the majority against him. Subscribe to this channel immediately because what I am about to walk you through is not just a Supreme Court ruling. This is the complete collapse of Trump's claimed emergency trade authority. This is his own judicial appointees turning against the legal framework that built his second-term presidency. And this is a $170 billion international refund crisis that has triggered the worst transatlantic diplomatic rupture in modern history. Here is what actually happened in the 47 minutes between the court's decision and the European Union's emergency response, because the cascade that followed reveals how quickly decades of alliance architecture can shatter from a single constitutional ruling. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion with surgical precision. Quote, "The International Emergency Economic Powers Act was designed for genuine national emergencies requiring immediate economic response. It was not designed to grant the executive branch permanent authority to restructure global trade relationships through indefinite tariff impositions. The court found that Trump's use of IEEPA to impose what he called reciprocal tariffs on virtually every trading partner exceeded the statute's emergency powers framework. The ruling struck down tariffs affecting 15,000 American companies and every major U.S. ally. The steel and aluminum tariffs imposed under Section 232 national security provisions survived, but everything else implemented under emergency powers authority collapsed instantly." At 12:19 p.m., exactly 32 minutes after the Supreme Court published its decision, the European Commission issued its first statement through Deputy Spokesperson Olaf Gill. Quote, "We remain in close contact with the U.S. administration as we seek clarity on the steps they intend to take in response to this ruling." The language was diplomatic. The implications were devastating. The EU-U.S. trade deal negotiated last July and set for parliamentary ratification next Tuesday was built on a foundation that no longer existed. The agreement's centerpiece, a blanket 15% tariff on EU exports in exchange for zero duties on U.S. industrial goods, had been implemented using the very IEEPA authority the Supreme Court just ruled invalid. European lawmakers immediately understood they were staring at a legal and economic void. The deal they were about to ratify was based on tariff authority that American courts had just declared unconstitutional. At 12:34 p.m., President Trump posted on Truth Social, "The Supreme Court decision is deeply disappointing and wrong. I am exploring all available options to continue protecting American workers and businesses." He did not mention the $170 billion refund liability the Treasury Department now faced, or the fact that his own appointees had authored the decision that destroyed his trade policy. But Trump was not finished. At 3:22 p.m., 4 hours and 35 minutes after the Supreme Court ruling, Trump announced he was signing an executive order imposing a new 10% global tariff using Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. This was a different law, a different legal theory, and a desperate attempt to circumvent the court's constitutional ruling. Trump held a hasty press conference where his fury was barely contained. When asked about Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, both of whom he nominated, Trump's response was electric. Quote, "I think their decision was terrible. I think it's an embarrassment to their families." He paused, visibly calculating his words. "I am ashamed that certain members of the court did not have the courage to do what was right for this country." The Section 122 authority Trump claimed gave him the power to impose the new 10% tariff, but it came with severe limitations the president did not mention. Section 122 requires congressional approval after 150 days. It was designed as temporary authority pending legislative action, not as permanent presidential trade power. At 4:15 p.m., as trading floors across 3 continents processed Trump's defiant response, European Parliament Trade Committee Chair Bernd Lange issued a statement that would reshape transatlantic relations. Quote, "In light of the legal uncertainty created by today's Supreme Court ruling and the American administration's response, the Committee on International Trade will hold an emergency session Monday morning to reassess our position on the U.S.-EU trade framework." Translation: the EU was preparing to pull the plug on the biggest trade deal of Trump's presidency. The emergency meeting scheduled for Monday was originally planned as a procedural vote to advance the trade agreement toward final ratification. Instead, it would become a funeral for 18 months of painstaking negotiation between Washington and Brussels. Sources familiar with the committee's discussions describe the mood as stunned anger. European lawmakers had spent 8 months selling the controversial 15% tariff rate to their constituents as the price of accessing American markets. Now they learned that the legal authority underlying that tariff structure had been ruled unconstitutional by the same courts that would be expected to enforce future trade disputes. Hit that like button right now if you understand the significance. This is not just about tariffs or trade deals. The algorithm decides what breaks through. You decide whether this analysis reaches people who need to understand how constitutional crises destroy international agreements in real time. By 5 p.m., the diplomatic aftershocks were cascading across European capitals. French President Emmanuel Macron's office released a carefully worded statement expressing concern about legal consistency in our partners' trade policy implementation. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was more direct, telling reporters in Berlin, "We cannot ratify agreements built on authority that American courts have ruled unconstitutional." The British response carried particular sting. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, speaking from Downing Street, welcomed what he called a return to legal consistency in American trade policy. Britain, still negotiating its post-Brexit relationship with the EU, saw an opportunity to position itself as a more reliable partner than the constitutional chaos across the Atlantic. At 6:47 p.m., Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell issued a statement that revealed the Republican Party's impossible position. Quote, "The president has the right to explore all legal avenues to protect American interests. However, the Supreme Court has spoken clearly on the limits of executive emergency powers." McConnell was simultaneously defending Trump's authority while acknowledging the court's rejection of that authority. Republican senators faced a nightmare scenario. The Chamber of Commerce was demanding they oppose Trump's new Section 122 tariffs, which would require congressional approval in 150 days. But Trump's base was demanding loyalty to his trade war approach, regardless of constitutional limits. Senator John Cornyn of Texas, who had supported Trump's trade agenda throughout his first term, told reporters, "We need to study the Supreme Court's reasoning carefully before committing to any new tariff framework." Cornyn was preparing to break with Trump rather than face the political liability of defending legally questionable trade policy. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri took the opposite approach, attacking the Supreme Court directly. Quote, "6 justices have decided they know better than the American people who elected President Trump to fight for fair trade. This decision prioritizes legal technicalities over American jobs." Hawley was positioning himself as Trump's defender against judicial overreach. The Republican divide was crystallizing in real time. Senators from agricultural states were quietly celebrating the tariff invalidation, knowing their farmers would benefit from restored export markets. Senators from manufacturing states were torn between supporting Trump and avoiding the economic disruption of ongoing trade uncertainty. At 7:30 p.m., the first concrete consequence materialized. Dow Jones Industrial Average Futures, which had been down 200 points immediately after Trump's 10% tariff announcement, suddenly surged 400 points as traders realized the Supreme Court had created a pathway to trade normalization. Markets were betting that Congress would refuse to extend Trump's Section 122 authority, effectively ending the trade war the court had declared unconstitutional. But the celebration was premature. Trump was not accepting defeat. At 8:15 p.m., Trump posted a video to Truth Social that would haunt transatlantic relations for months. Quote, "The Supreme Court made a terrible mistake today, but I have many tools at my disposal. The 10% tariff I signed this afternoon is just the beginning. We will protect American workers and American businesses by any means necessary." The phrase "any means necessary" sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles in Brussels, London, and Berlin. European diplomats interpreted Trump's language as a threat to use presidential powers beyond those contemplated by existing trade law. If Trump was willing to circumvent one Supreme Court ruling, what would prevent him from circumventing the next one? At 9 p.m., European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen convened an emergency video conference with the leaders of all 27 EU member states. According to sources familiar with the call, von der Leyen presented 3 options: proceed with ratification and hope for legal clarity, pause the process pending American constitutional resolution, or terminate negotiations entirely and pursue alternative partnerships. French President Macron reportedly argued for termination, calling the American constitutional crisis proof that our partner cannot guarantee the legal framework necessary for long-term economic cooperation. German Chancellor Scholz favored suspension, arguing that Europe should wait for the American political system to resolve its trade authority questions. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, whose government had been among the strongest European supporters of the US-EU deal, reportedly said, "We cannot explain to our voters why we agreed to higher tariffs based on authority that American courts say never existed." The call lasted 47 minutes. By its conclusion, von der Leyen had the authority to instruct the European Parliament's Trade Committee to suspend the ratification process indefinitely. At 9:52 p.m., von der Leyen's office released a statement that would end Trump's hopes of rebuilding the transatlantic trade relationship on his terms. Quote, "The European Union requires legal certainty and constitutional consistency from our trading partners. Monday's committee session will address the fundamental questions raised by today's Supreme Court ruling and the American administration's response." Translation: the EU-US trade deal was dead. By 10:30 p.m., the international reaction was accelerating beyond European capitals. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau welcomed the restoration of legal frameworks for international trade, positioning Canada as a reliable alternative partner for European businesses seeking North American market access. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida announced that Japan would expedite trade negotiations with the EU to fill the vacuum created by American constitutional uncertainty. Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor who had been building alternative trade partnerships during his recent diplomatic tour, issued a statement from Ottawa that would reshape global trade relationships. Quote, "Today's events demonstrate why the international community must build economic partnerships on the foundation of legal consistency and constitutional reliability. Canada stands ready to lead where America has chosen chaos." Trump's constitutional crisis had created a once-in-a-generation opportunity for America's competitors to isolate the United States from its traditional economic partnerships. Here is what we are watching for over the next 7 days. First, does the European Parliament vote Monday to suspend trade deal negotiations indefinitely, or do they attempt to salvage the agreement by demanding new legal guarantees from Washington? If they suspend, the EU-US economic relationship enters a period of uncertainty that could last months. If they demand guarantees Trump cannot provide, the breakdown becomes immediate and public. Second, do Republican senators signal opposition to Trump's Section 122 tariff before the 150-day congressional approval deadline? If 5 Republican senators publicly oppose extension, Trump's new tariff authority collapses in advance. If Republicans remain united behind Trump, the constitutional crisis deepens as Congress prepares to override Supreme Court precedent through legislative action. Third, how many companies file Treasury refund claims by Friday's informal deadline established by legal precedent? If more than 10,000 companies demand refunds, the administrative burden could paralyze Treasury operations for months. If fewer than 3,000 file, it suggests businesses are waiting to see whether Trump's new tariffs create a different legal framework. Fourth, does Canada accelerate its alternative trade alliance building announced by Mark Carney, specifically targeting European partners abandoned by American constitutional chaos? If Carney announces concrete partnership agreements by Thursday, it demonstrates that America's allies are actively decoupling from U.S. economic leadership. If he delays, it suggests they are waiting to see whether American politics stabilizes. Fifth, do federal courts issue injunctions against Trump's Section 122 tariffs based on the Supreme Court's constitutional reasoning in today's IEEPA decision? If district judges rule that Section 122 suffers from the same emergency powers problems as IEEPA, Trump's entire tariff authority crumbles. If courts allow Section 122 to proceed, it creates space for congressional resolution. Sixth, does Trump escalate his attacks on Justices Gorsuch and Barrett, specifically questioning their loyalty or competence in ways that undermine Supreme Court legitimacy? If Trump continues attacking his own appointees, it fractures conservative legal support for his presidency. If he retreats from direct court criticism, it suggests political advisors have convinced him the attacks are counterproductive. Seventh, do America's trading partners coordinate a unified response at next Tuesday's World Trade Organization emergency session requested by the European Union? If major economies present a common position challenging American trade authority, it isolates the United States within the global economic system. If they present individual national responses, America retains the ability to negotiate bilateral solutions. Here are the three scenarios. Scenario 1, constitutional compromise. Trump accepts the Supreme Court's IEEPA ruling and works with Congress to create new limited tariff authority that satisfies both constitutional requirements and trade policy objectives. European Parliament suspends but does not terminate negotiations, waiting for American legal clarity. Section 122 tariffs expire after 150 days when Congress refuses extension, but a face-saving bilateral agreement emerges that reduces trade tensions without violating Supreme Court precedent. This is the managed resolution scenario. Scenario 2, legal war. Trump fights the Supreme Court ruling through executive orders claiming alternative constitutional authority, while Congress splits along party lines over trade policy. European Union terminates all trade negotiations and begins coordinating with Canada, Japan, and Britain to isolate American economic policy. Federal courts issue competing rulings on presidential trade authority, creating legal chaos that paralyzes international business planning. This is the institutional breakdown scenario. Scenario 3, America isolated. Trump's Section 122 tariffs are struck down by federal courts applying today's Supreme Court reasoning, leaving him with no legal trade war authority. Republican senators openly revolt against Trump's trade policy to save their relationships with business constituencies. European Union, Canada, Japan, and Britain announce a coordinated alternative trade partnership specifically designed to exclude the United States until American constitutional questions are resolved. America first becomes America alone. This is the complete collapse scenario. Subscribe right now, like this video, comment with your prediction of which scenario plays out over the next 7 days. I am tracking all three. What I know for certain right now, the Supreme Court struck down $170 billion in Trump tariffs by a 6-3 vote, with Trump's own appointees Gorsuch and Barrett siding against him. The ruling invalidated IEEPA emergency authority for trade policy. Trump responded by imposing new 10% global tariffs using Section 122 authority that expires in 150 days without congressional approval. The European Union called an emergency parliament session for Monday to reassess the U.S.-EU trade deal worth $1.2 trillion in annual commerce. European Commission President von der Leyen has authority to suspend ratification indefinitely. Canada, Japan, and Britain are positioning themselves as alternatives to American economic partnership. Republican senators are split between defending Trump and protecting business relationships. More than 15,000 American companies are eligible for tariff refunds totaling $170 billion. This is not over. This is American trade authority and constitutional freefall. This is the transatlantic alliance fracturing over legal questions that should have been resolved before international agreements were negotiated. And we are watching in real time as 7 decades of economic partnership between America and Europe hangs in the balance of a congressional vote that may never come.